Officer Craig Pruitt thought he had found easy prey. A black man driving alone on a dark Georgia highway at nearly midnight behind the wheel of a car that cost more than most people in Harlow County earned in 2 years. That was all Pruitt needed to see. He didn't ask questions. He didn't wait for a traffic violation. He just flipped the lights, watched the luxury sedan pull over smoothly and carefully to the shoulder, and felt the familiar warmth of anticipated dominance spreading through his chest like the first sip of something strong. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea that the man sitting behind the wheel of that charcoal Cadillac, the man already placing both hands at 10 and 2 before the cruiser door had even opened, was not just a citizen, not just a lawyer, and not just a federal official. He was the lead prosecutor of the United States Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, the man personally responsible for drafting 19 sealed federal indictments, 19 currently sitting in a locked titanium attaché case on the back seat of that car. Indictments that were scheduled to be filed with a federal judge at 8 o'clock the following morning. Indictments that contained near the top of the very first document the full legal names of Officer Craig Pruitt and his supervisor, Sergeant Ronald Voss. The man didn't know it yet, but in exactly 8 minutes, Officer Pruitt and the sergeant who raised him were going to find out exactly who they had pulled over, exactly what they had almost opened with a pocket knife, and exactly how catastrophically they had miscalculated the last night of the lives they had known. Stick around, because when that cruiser's laptop screen finally loaded the federal database results, 2 men who had spent their careers making other people feel small were going to discover what it felt like to be nothing at all. What happened on that rain-slicked stretch of Harlow County Road over the next 8 minutes is the kind of story that makes you want to call someone because you won't believe it until you hear it out loud. The dashboard clock on the Cadillac read 11:37 p.m. When Marcus Ellison noticed the headlights for the second time, he had first registered them about 2 miles back on the long straightaway past the old Harlow Grain Co-op building, just a pair of high beams sitting at a steady distance behind him, the gap never narrowing, never widening, simply maintaining. A cruiser. He recognized the particular geometry of police headlights in a rear-view mirror, the way some men recognize the sound of their own name being spoken in a crowd. Not quite a sound, not quite a sight, more of a frequency that his body had learned to receive before his conscious mind processed it. He had been receiving that frequency since he was 16 years old, when his father pulled the family Ford onto the shoulder of State Route 12 and quietly explained before any lights appeared that a cruiser had been following them for 3 blocks and that Marcus needed to put both hands flat on his knees and not say a single word unless directly addressed. He was 16. He had done nothing wrong. His father had done nothing wrong. But his father's hands were perfectly steady on the steering wheel, and his voice was perfectly steady as he spoke, and that steadiness was its own kind of grief. The grief of a lesson that should not have to be taught anyway, because the alternative was something neither of them could afford. Marcus Ellison was 53 years old now. He was a United States Department of Justice attorney, the lead prosecutor of the Civil Rights Division's Police Integrity Task Force, and he had spent 11 months building a federal case against one of the most corrupt sheriff's department precincts in the state of Georgia. He still put both hands at 10 and 2 when a cruiser appeared in his rearview mirror. He still kept his voice at a register that did not threaten. He still narrated his movements out loud slowly, precisely ensuring that any recording device within range captured his compliance in unambiguous detail. He had been doing it for 37 years. He would be doing it in all probability for the rest of his life. He checked his speedometer, 33 miles per hour in a 35 zone. He had not exceeded the posted limit at any point during the 40-minute drive from the federal office building in downtown Atlanta to his home in Meadowbrook Estates, the leafy, quiet neighborhood on the western edge of Harlow County, where he had lived for 9 years. He had used his turn signal at every intersection, including the deserted ones at 11 o'clock at night, where there was no traffic in any direction for half a mile. He had come to complete 3-second stops at every stop sign. His registration was current. His insurance was current. His tags were current. His driving had been, by any objective measure, flawless. The cruiser remained. Marcus kept his eyes on the road ahead. His jaw tightened slightly, not in fear, because this was not fear, not exactly. It was something more complicated and more exhausting than fear. Something that lived in a different organ and had a different texture. Something he had never quite found the right word for in 53 years of looking. And then his jaw relaxed again, because he was not going to let this particular night be the night that got the better of him. On the back seat of the Cadillac, resting against the black leather upholstery with the particular solidity of something built for a purpose, was the attaché case. It was titanium-brushed silver government issue from a contractor who made the same model for certain agencies that didn't advertise what they needed secured. It had a combination lock with a 6-digit numerical code and a secondary key cylinder. It weighed 11 pounds empty. Tonight, it was not empty. Tonight, it held 19 sealed federal indictments, each one the product of 11 months of work, each one the culmination of witness testimony. Financial forensics, surveillance records, dashboard camera analysis, and the meticulous reconstruction of evidence that had been deliberately buried, altered, and destroyed by the men it named. The documents were printed on Department of Justice letterhead. They were bound in blue folders numbered sequentially and organized in the order they would be filed. The top indictment, the one sitting face up on the stack, was designated Count 1A. Marcus had driven the case files himself tonight rather than sending them with a courier. He had made that decision 3 weeks ago after a DOJ courier vehicle assigned to a separate division had been broken into in a downtown Atlanta parking garage. Nothing related to his case had been taken. Different operation entirely, but the incident had crystallized something he had already been feeling. These documents were too important to trust to anyone else for the last 12 hours before filing. He had stayed in the office until 10:15, finished the last revision to the 19th indictment, made 2 copies of the full file set and logged them with his deputy counsel, and then placed the originals in the attaché case himself. He was 3 miles from home when the headlights settled in behind him. His daughter Imani had called him at 9 o'clock. She was 17, a junior at Harlow County High School, the kind of 17-year-old who had her father's attention to detail and her late mother's capacity for warmth, a combination that regularly reduced Marcus to a specific kind of pride that he had no language for either. She had called because it was past 9 and he had said he would be home by 9. And she was not worried about him so much as she was registering on his behalf that he had not been home before 9 o'clock more than twice in the last 6 weeks. The case, she had asked. Tonight's the last night he had told her. I promise. She had made him promise again. He had promised again. She had told him she would leave the porch light on. He thought about the porch light now turning left onto the long county road that would carry him through the last 3 miles of unlit highway between the city outskirts and the residential roads of Meadowbrook Estates. He thought about the way Imani had sounded on the phone, not afraid, not upset, just a little tired, in a way that no 17-year-old should have to be tired, a tiredness that came from understanding, without anyone having explained it to her, that her father's work mattered too much to rush and cost too much not to finish. He was going to be home in 20 minutes. The cruiser lit up behind him, and the night went red and blue. Marcus let out a slow breath through his nose. He guided the Cadillac smoothly to the right shoulder, parking it beneath the particular amber glow of the one functioning street lamp on this stretch of road. He shifted into park. He cut the engine. He lowered the driver's side window. He turned on the interior dome light. He placed both hands at 10 and 2 fingers spread clearly visible. Then he waited. He was already narrating inside his own mind the legal record of what was about to happen. He had been doing that since the cruiser first appeared in his rearview mirror. Some habits were professional, some were survival. He had been on the night rotation for 3 days, and he was bored in the way that men like Craig Pruitt got bored on quiet shifts, not passively, not restfully, but with a restless, prickly energy that needed somewhere to go. Pruitt was 46 years old, 18 years on the Harlow County Sheriff's Department, currently assigned to the 15th precinct, which covered the outer residential and commercial zones west of the city. He was a large man, thick through the shoulders, carrying the extra weight of middle age in his midsection in a way that pushed the lower buttons of his uniform shirt into a permanent tension like a garment always on the edge of making a complaint. His boots were scuffed at the toes in a way that suggested they had been kicked into doors and across floors that hadn't invited them. His jaw was always set, the muscles at the hinge visible even in low light, working a piece of spearmint gum with the slow mechanical rhythm of a man who had been chewing on something harder than gum for a very long time. His colleagues called him a closer. His record showed a case clearance rate that sat comfortably above the department average, and Sergeant Ronald Voss, the man who had trained him. The man who had moved through the department alongside him for nearly 2 decades had cited that clearance rate in 3 separate performance reviews as evidence of Pruitt's effectiveness. What the performance reviews did not record and what Internal Affairs had declined to investigate, despite 31 civilian complaints filed over 18 years, was the mechanism by which Craig Pruitt closed cases. He fabricated probable cause. He had been doing it since his 3rd year on the job when Voss had quietly explained to him that the only way to put the right people away was to make the paperwork say what the situation required, regardless of what the situation actually contained. Voss had not framed this as corruption. He had framed it as competence, the ability to translate what you knew to be true into what the legal standard required on paper. And Pruitt, 28 years old, brand new to this particular kind of power, had found that the translation came naturally to him. Tonight, he had been patrolling the outer county road that ran along the western border of Meadowbrook Estates, an area he rarely covered technically outside his standard rotation zone. But the night was slow, and the Estates Road was the kind of road where expensive cars moved after midnight, and expensive cars after midnight meant opportunity. He hadn't been looking for anything specific. He had been looking for whatever presented itself. The headlights of the charcoal Cadillac had appeared in his forward vision, approximately 4 miles from the county line, moving east toward the residential developments at a careful, precise speed. And the sight of it, the car, the hour, the highway, the single dark silhouette behind the wheel had activated something in Craig Pruitt that he would have described if asked as instinct. It was not instinct. It was a reflex built from 18 years of choosing targets based on who he believed the legal system would protect and who he believed it would not. But Craig Pruitt had been doing it long enough that he genuinely could no longer tell the difference between those two things. That was in its way the most dangerous part of him. He pulled in behind the Cadillac at a comfortable distance and followed it for 2 miles. The car did not speed up. It did not slow down. It did not weave. It did not hesitate at a single turn. He watched it use its signals at 2 intersections where there was no other traffic in sight, and something about that small, careful act, the deliberate compliance of a man who knew he was being watched, registered in Pruitt's chest as a provocation rather than evidence of innocence. He did not examine that feeling. He simply reached for the light bar switch. He flipped it at 11:37 p.m., 2 miles from the Meadowbrook Estates entrance. His rookie partner, Officer Danny Carver, was in the passenger seat. Carver was 26, 14 months out of the academy, still carrying the slight, barely perceptible hesitance of a man who had learned the rules carefully and was now in the process of learning in a way the academy had not prepared him for that. The rules were applied differently in practice than they appeared on paper. He watched Pruitt flip the lights and said nothing because he had learned in 14 months that saying something was rarely worth what it cost. The Cadillac pulled over with the smooth, unhurried precision of a car being driven by someone who had been expecting exactly this. That precision, that lack of surprise or scramble bothered Pruitt more than a panic stop would have. He liked the scramble. He liked the nervous energy that moved through a car when the lights came on, the sudden dart of interior light as a driver checked their appearance, the slight overcorrection of a wheel, the too-fast brake application of someone with a guilty conscience. The Cadillac gave him none of it. It simply moved to the right shoulder in a single composed motion, parked itself perfectly straight beneath the amber street lamp, and went still. The interior dome light came on before Pruitt had even opened his cruiser door. He stepped out into the night. The air was cold and damp, carrying the smell of cut grass and distant rain, the kind of Georgia late autumn chill that settled into the back of the throat. He adjusted his belt, rested his right hand on the butt of his holstered sidearm, not drawing it, not gripping it, just letting it know he was there, letting the man in the car know it was there, and walked toward the driver's side with the deliberate, slightly lateral swagger that 18 years of performing authority had carved into his gait. Carver took the passenger side flashlight already out beam, sweeping the interior through the tinted glass. Marcus Ellison's hands were at 10 and 2 fingers spread before Pruitt reached the window. Pruitt leaned down. He placed his forearms on the windowsill, bringing his face close to the driver's, close enough that the smell of spearmint gum carried into the car's warm interior. He shone his own flashlight directly into the driver's face, the beam steady and deliberate, positioned to force the driver to squint, to look away to register the discomfort of being illuminated without consent. The driver did not squint. He looked directly into the beam for a moment, then turned his gaze calmly to Pruitt's face, and the steadiness of his expression in the face of the light made something cold move through Pruitt's stomach, a sensation he immediately suppressed. "License, registration, and proof of insurance," Pruitt said. Flat. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the hour or the cold or the two of them on a dark road. "Good evening, officer." The voice was deep, resonant, unhurried. "May I ask what the reason for the stop is?" Pruitt's eyes narrowed fractionally. He hated that. He hated the ones who asked the ones who understood that they were entitled to ask the ones who asked it without anger or panic, the ones who asked it the way a person asks a reasonable question and genuinely expects a reasonable answer. "I said license and registration. Do you have a hearing issue?" "I heard you clearly," the man said, and his eyes, dark and completely unafraid, stayed on Pruitt's. "Before I reach into my jacket or my glove compartment, I'm legally entitled to understand the reasonable, articulable suspicion for this stop." The smirk on Pruitt's face shifted into something harder. He hated the big words most of all, not because he didn't understand them, but because they were a form of armoring, and armored people were harder to move. "You were crossing the fog line back there," Pruitt said, constructing the lie with the ease of long practice. "Looked like you might be impaired. Now I'm not going to ask you a third time." It was a complete fabrication, and both men knew it. The Cadillac's dash cam, running silently since the engine had started, had recorded every foot of the drive from the Federal Building to this shoulder, including the last 2 miles under surveillance. There was no fog line crossing. There had been no drift, no weave, no hesitation. The record was being made in real time, and Craig Pruitt was unaware of it. Marcus Ellison stated precisely where his wallet was, inside left breast pocket, and where the registration and insurance were glove compartment, and told Pruitt exactly what he was about to do before he did it. Every word was clear, deliberate, and spoken at a volume that Pruitt's own dashcam would capture in full. Pruitt took the documents. He didn't look at the name on the license. He wasn't interested in the name yet. He was interested in the man's face, looking for the softening, the slight subsidence of resistance that indicated the moment when a person decided that compliance was less costly than dignity. He wasn't finding it. He turned the flashlight back into Marcus's face. "Where are you coming from?" "Work." "Work." Pruitt let the words sit for a moment, his eyes moving around the interior of the car, the legal pad on the passenger seat, the cup of cold coffee in the console holder, the dark shape of the attaché case in the back seat. "What kind of work keeps a man out at midnight?" "Professional work," Marcus said. "The kind that is not relevant to a traffic stop. Whose car is this?" "The registration is in your hand." Pruitt's face flushed in the cold air, a mottled red crawling up from his collar. The casual, precise way this man answered questions, never a fraction more than the question required, never a fraction less. Never leaving an opening was beginning to function on him like sandpaper on a burn. "All right, wise guy, step out of the vehicle." "I decline," Marcus said, and his hands returned to the steering wheel unhurried. "You have my documents. If you believe a citation is warranted for crossing a fog line, write the citation. I'll contest it through the proper channels. There is no legal basis under these circumstances to order me out." Pruitt knew the case law. He knew Pennsylvania versus. Mims and he invoked it with the authority of a man who had used it 100 times the right of an officer to order a driver out of a vehicle during any lawful traffic stop, regardless of whether the driver had done anything to justify the specific order. What Pruitt did not examine, what he was constitutionally incapable of examining in this particular moment, on this particular shoulder of road, with this particular man, was whether the traffic stop itself was lawful. The case law that protected his right to order the driver out depended entirely on the stop itself having a legal foundation. There was no legal foundation. There was only a black man in an expensive car at midnight and 18 years of choosing targets and a reflex so ingrained that Craig Pruitt had genuinely lost the ability to distinguish it from professional judgment. He told Marcus what the law allowed. Marcus nodded, acknowledged the case correctly, and said quietly, "Very well. I am stepping out. I am unarmed. I am not resisting. I would like you to note for the record that I have complied with every request." He unbuckled his seatbelt with deliberate slowness. He pulled the door handle. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped out onto the shoulder, and he stood to his full height 6 feet 1 inch, and in the amber light of the street lamp in his charcoal wool suit that he had put on at 6 that morning and had been wearing for 17.5 hours, he was an imposing, entirely composed presence that towered over Craig Pruitt by a clear 3 inches. The size difference registered in Pruitt's body before it registered in his mind. He felt it as a slight shift, a minor recalibration, and his response to that recalibration was immediate and automatic. He escalated. He reached for his cuffs. "Turn around. Hands on the roof. Spread your feet." "Am I being detained?" Marcus asked. "What is the cause?" "Officer safety," Pruitt said. "You're acting squirrely." It was the word of a man who had learned 18 years ago that officer safety and furtive movements and acting squirrely were phrases that appeared in incident reports without anyone ever having to define them. They were the elastic language of a system that had for a very long time stretched in one direction and one direction only. Marcus placed his hands flat on the cold, wet metal of the Cadillac's roof. He spread his legs as instructed. He said loudly and clearly, "I am complying. I have not consented to a search of my person or my vehicle. I state this for the record." Pruitt grabbed Marcus's left arm and began a search that was neither cursory nor gentle. It was aggressive, invasive, the hands moving with unnecessary force up the legs across the torso into the pockets of the wool overcoat, with the pressing, bruising certainty of a man using his hands to communicate something that the situation did not technically require. There was nothing. No weapon, no contraband, nothing that justified a single additional action. But Pruitt did not stop. He snapped the steel cuff onto Marcus's left wrist with a click that was slightly too sharp, slightly too tight, 1 notch past what the training manual specified as standard, and Marcus felt the edge of the steel pressing into the skin of his wrist with a particular, familiar bite. He did not make a sound. He did not pull away. He let his right arm be taken and secured, and he stood there handcuffed against his own car in the rain that had just begun to fall, and he closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Marcus Ellison felt the full weight of what it meant to be exactly who he was and to be standing exactly where he was standing. He felt the 1,000 previous versions of this moment, different roads, different officers, different decades that had compressed themselves into the muscle memory of compliance. He felt the particular, very specific exhaustion of a man who had spent his entire adult life fighting the thing that was happening to him right now on a professional level, on an institutional level, with every legal tool available to him, and who nonetheless found himself on a dark road in handcuffs for the crime of driving home from work. He opened his eyes. He was not afraid. He was clear, completely, almost dangerously clear. On the other side of the car, Carver had gone back to the cruiser to run the plates and the license. He was at his laptop, the database query processing, waiting for results. The local system was, as it frequently was at this hour, slow. He watched the progress bar on the screen and did not think about what it might return, because in 14 months he had run perhaps 300 license checks, and they had never returned anything unusual enough to require him to actually think about what to do with the result. That streak was at this moment approximately 4 minutes from ending. While Carver waited at the laptop, Pruitt began searching the Cadillac. He had not been given consent. He had been explicitly denied consent loudly on camera twice. He did not appear to register this as a constraint. He opened the driver's door, reached in, and began pulling items from the center console. A phone charger, a folded receipt from a gas station, a small bottle of hand sanitizer, a pack of pens, and depositing them on the passenger seat with the careless thoroughness of a man who has been doing this long enough that he no longer thinks about what he is looking for, only about the act of looking. He moved to the glove compartment. He let the owner's manual and a small folder of service records spill onto the floor. He felt behind the dashboard panels. He checked under the driver's seat and found nothing but a compact tire pressure gauge neatly clipped to a small magnetic mount. From the outside of the car, handcuffed to the door pillar at his back, Marcus watched through the rear passenger window. He did not speak. He had already stated his legal position regarding the search, and repeating it would accomplish nothing except potentially provide Pruitt with a pretext for escalating the verbal confrontation. What Marcus was doing instead, what he had been doing since the lights first appeared in his rearview mirror, was creating a record. Every word, every action, every instruction given, and every instruction complied with or declined was being captured by his dashcam's audio, by the cruiser's dashcam audio, and by the bodycam that Carver was wearing and that was currently pointed in the general direction of the scene. Pruitt moved to the back seat. And there was the attaché case. He hauled it out of the car and set it on the trunk next to where Marcus stood, right at Marcus's left elbow. It landed with a solid, heavy thud, 11 pounds plus contents, and the combination lock glinted under the street lamp. Pruitt tapped the case with his flashlight, a slow, deliberate tap, and looked at Marcus with the expression of a man who believes he has found something. "What's in the briefcase?" "That case contains legally privileged federal documents," Marcus said. His voice was flat and precise. "If you attempt to open it, you are committing a federal offense under Title 18 United States Code." Pruitt smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had heard people cite their rights in the dark for 18 years and had learned that rights in practice bent in the direction of whoever was holding the handcuff key. "You want to open it up for me?" he said in the tone of a man not actually asking a question. "No. Then, I'm going to need to open it myself." "Craig." Carver's voice came from the cruiser, and it had something in it, a quality of constriction, like a man talking through a narrowed throat that should have given Pruitt pause. But Pruitt was looking at the attaché case, and he was not paying attention to the quality of his partner's voice. The sound of a heavy pickup truck engine came from behind them, and a pair of high beams swung off the road and onto the shoulder, parking at an angle behind the cruiser. The door opened, and Sergeant Ronald Voss stepped down onto the wet asphalt. Voss was 51 years old. He was a large man, heavy in the way of a former athlete who had carried extra weight for long enough that it had begun to feel like part of his original architecture. His face was wide and red, the redness permanent, rather than flush the complexion of a man who had spent 22 years outdoors in all weather and indoors under fluorescent lights. He had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He'd been home apparently before the scanner pulled him back out, and he wore a dark county sheriff's department jacket over civilian clothes. Voss had a police scanner in his personal vehicle. He monitored his men's stops the way a general monitors a battlefield, not to assist but to maintain situational awareness to know where problems were developing before they became public record. He had been Pruitt's sergeant for 9 of Pruitt's 18 years on the force. He had been the one who first showed Pruitt how the elastic language worked, how officer safety and furtive movements appeared in reports, how probable cause could be constructed after the fact with enough care and the right vocabulary. He was in the most direct sense possible the architect of Craig Pruitt's professional character. He took in the scene with experienced eyes handcuffed black man, in an expensive suit standing beside a luxury sedan in the rain, Pruitt at the trunk with a flashlight and a case, the car's interior visibly disturbed. His expression did not change. He walked toward Pruitt with the comfort of a man approaching a situation he has managed many times before. "What have we got?" he asked, his eyes moving over Marcus with the kind of clinical assessment that reduced a human being to a category. "Swerving on County Road 9, Pruitt said. "Refused to comply initially. D.U. I suspected. Running a background check now. Car smells like weed," Voss added, completing the story's architecture before he had spent 30 seconds at the scene. He said it casually, the way a man adds a detail he has always known, and both he and Pruitt registered it as the completion of a legal structure they now had between the two of them, stated a reason to search the vehicle that did not require Pruitt's fog line fabrication to hold up under scrutiny. Marcus's eyes snapped to Voss. "That is a fabrication," he said, and his voice carried into the rain with an authority that had nothing to do with volume. "I am completely compliant and have been since this stop began. There is no marijuana odor in this vehicle. I am explicitly denying consent to search my car or this case, and any evidence obtained through this search will be inadmissible as the fruit of an illegal stop." Voss stepped into Marcus's space close enough that Marcus could see the individual stitching on the department jacket. He pointed a finger within inches of Marcus's face. He told Marcus to speak when spoken to, and that he had dealt with 100 people like him, and that the suit didn't impress anyone out here. Marcus looked at Voss the way a surgeon looks at something that requires removal. "Sergeant," he said, and dropped his voice one register, and both men for just a fraction of a second, the smallest possible fraction, paused. "I strongly advise you to check the dashcam footage from your officer's vehicle and from mine before taking another action tonight." Voss laughed. It was a harsh, flat sound barking against the wet dark. "Hear that Pruitt Legal Eagle here wants to show us his dashcam." He turned back toward the car. "Fowler, toss the car. We've got probable cause." There was no officer named Fowler on this stop. He meant Carver, and the miscommunication was trivial in content and vast in implication. Voss had not bothered to learn the name of the rookie officer at this scene because the rookie officer was not the point. The point was the case on the trunk and what might be inside it, and the small private pleasure of opening something that a man had explicitly told you not to open. Carver from the cruiser called back that the database was lagging. His voice had that same quality of constriction that Pruitt had ignored 3 minutes ago. "I said, toss it," Voss said, and turned back to Marcus with the settled satisfaction of a man who believes the universe is still arranging itself according to his specifications. Pruitt pulled on a pair of latex gloves from his uniform pocket and returned to the interior of the car with a focused energy that was different from the earlier searching, more targeted, more purposeful, the movements of a man who has been given official sanction and is now performing rather than merely conducting. He went through the back seat with the same casual destructiveness he had applied to the front. He checked the rear door pockets, the seatback compartments, the floor. He found nothing except a gym bag containing a change of clothes, which he opened, examined, and left open on the seat, and a folded parking receipt from the DOJ building's underground garage, which he let fall to the floor. Then he returned to the attaché case. He stood in front of it on the trunk, flexed his gloved fingers, and assessed the lock with the particular focus of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is now simply working out the method. The combination lock was recessed into a chrome housing, and the key cylinder beside it was small and precise-looking. Neither appeared to be yielding to simple manipulation. He reached into his pants pocket and produced a folding knife. A heavy-duty model 4-inch blade, the kind carried by a man who uses a knife regularly enough that it has developed a specific patina of use. He opened it with a single practiced motion and held it up blade angled toward the lock plate of the attaché case. Marcus spoke. He spoke quietly, but the rain and the relative silence of the road at midnight meant that every syllable carried to the dash cam, to the body cam, to the air itself. He stated his full legal name. He stated his title. He stated his agency. He stated the specific federal statute. Title 18 United States Code Section 1519 that criminalized the destruction, alteration, or concealment of evidence in a federal investigation. He stated that the case on the trunk contained sealed federal indictments currently under judicial review. He stated that the officer holding the knife had been informed on the record of all of the above, and that proceeding regardless would constitute willful obstruction of a federal investigation. Then he said very quietly, "I am asking you one final time to put the knife away." Voss looked at the knife, looked at Marcus, looked back at the knife. The arithmetic of his confidence had not yet changed. It was still adding up to impunity, still arriving at the same answer it had been arriving at for 22 years. He told Pruitt to open the case. Pruitt brought the blade toward the lock plate. "Craig." Carver's voice came from the cruiser window, and this time there was no suppressing the quality of it. It was not the voice of a man reporting a status update. It was the voice of a man who has just read something that fundamentally rearranged his understanding of where he was standing. "Craig, you need to come here. Right now." "Sergeant." "Right now." Pruitt paused. The blade was an inch from the lock. He looked over his shoulder at the cruiser where Carver was visible through the windshield illuminated by the glow of the laptop screen, his face the color of old chalk. Voss let out an irritated breath, the sigh of a man being interrupted at the moment of resolution. He pushed off from where he had been leaning against the Cadillac and walked back to the cruiser with the heavy, ground-claiming steps of a man who expects whatever Carver has found to be either irrelevant or manageable. He leaned his head through the passenger window. He looked at the screen. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Sergeant Ronald Voss's hand, the one resting on the doorframe, slowly tightened until the knuckles went white. The federal database query had taken longer than usual because it had encountered a flag at the first tier of the National Law Enforcement Telecommunications System that it did not encounter on the vast majority of queries, a federal restriction marker, which meant the record being requested was not fully accessible to the standard state and county law enforcement interface, but instead required federal-level authorization to view the complete file. That restriction flag by itself was not unusual. Federal agents, certain government officials, people enrolled in witness protection programs, and others with legitimate security considerations had restricted records. Carver had seen the flag before once on a query that turned out to be a former DEA informant who had been given a new identity. The system had returned a partial record with a notice to contact the appropriate federal agency. This time, the system did not return a partial record. The flag cleared. Apparently, Marcus Ellison's record was authorized for view by the query itself, triggered by some protocol built into the task force designation, and the full record populated on Carver's screen in a single dense block of text topped by a red bordered banner. Carver read the banner first. Restricted access. Federal clearance required active federal investigative personnel do not detain without prior DOJ authorization. He read the name. Marcus A. Ellison. He read the date of birth. He read the home address, Meadowbrook Estates, which was the address on the license he was holding, which was 3 miles from where they were standing. He read the employment status, active. He read the agency, United States Department of Justice. He read the division, Civil Rights Division. He read the title, Special Counsel Police Integrity Task Force. He read the case designation, which appeared in capital letters and bold text in a way that suggested whoever had programmed this record had wanted it to be unmissable. Lead Prosecutor. Operation Clean. Sweep. Harlow County, Georgia. Indictments pending. Carver read those words 3 times each time, hoping they would rearrange themselves into something that meant less than what they said. They did not rearrange. They sat on the screen with the immovable certainty of text that has been placed there by someone with the authority to place it and the intention of being read. He looked out through the windshield at the scene on the shoulder. Marcus Ellison handcuffed, standing in the rain against the trunk of his own car. Pruitt with a folding knife angled at a titanium attaché case. Voss standing to the side with his arms crossed watching Pruitt work. Operation Clean Sweep, Harlow County. Indictments pending. Carver thought about his 14 months on this force. He thought about the things he had seen during those 14 months, the things he had been told were standard practice, the things that had given him a faint, persistent unease that he had learned to quiet by reminding himself that he was new, and that Voss and Pruitt had 22 and 18 years respectively, and that their combined experience surely outweighed his discomfort. He thought about the men whose names came across the booking log in the mornings after Pruitt's late shifts, young, predominantly black men, predominantly from the outer county roads and the less affluent neighborhoods, booked on weapons charges or possession charges with the same case officer, listed again and again and again. He picked up the radio mic, fumbled. It caught it before it hit the floor. His hands were shaking. "Sarge," he said through the window. "Sarge, you need to come see this." Voss leaned through the passenger window of the cruiser, resting his forearms on the doorframe, and squinted at the laptop screen. The fluorescent glow of it lit his face from below, the way a flashlight held under the chin changes the geography of a person's features into something unrecognizable. It took him several seconds to parse the bureaucratic formatting of the federal record. His eyes moved from line to line with the slightly labored focus of a man who has spent his career in physical and verbal arenas and has never quite made peace with paperwork. He hit the title line, Special Counsel Police Integrity Task Force. He hit the case designation, Operation Clean Sweep, Harlow County, Georgia. His jaw stopped moving. The spearmint gum sat inert in his mouth. He remained completely still for 3 seconds, 3 full counted seconds in which the only sounds were the rain on the cruiser roof and the faint crackle of the police radio and the distant mechanical rhythm of the spinning light bar. And then he lifted his head slowly from the laptop screen and turned to look through the rain-streaked windshield at the scene on the shoulder. The man standing handcuffed at the trunk of the Cadillac was not moving. He was standing with the same composed, entirely contained stillness that he had maintained since the moment the cruiser door opened. His head was turned slightly in the direction of the cruiser, and even from this distance through the rain and the windshield and the revolving colors of the light bar, Voss could see that the man's expression had not changed. It had not needed to change. It had been this expression from the beginning, patient, informed, and waiting for the moment when the men who had put him in handcuffs would understand what they had done. That moment was now. Voss pulled his head back out of the cruiser window. He stood upright very slowly, the way a man stands when his legs have become unreliable. His face went through 4 stages in the space of approximately 7 seconds. First, a blank, almost confused flatness, the expression of a man who has read something and is still processing whether it means what it appears to mean. Second, a slight rearrangement of the features toward something that resembled recognition, not the recognition of a person or a name, but the recognition of a geometry, the shape of a situation that has become fatally different from what it appeared to be. Third, comprehension. Full and irrevocable. The moment when the mind catches up to the eyes and the body receives the message that has been waiting for it. And fourth, arriving on the heels of the third with no gap between them, terror. Not the performative anxiety of a man caught in a small mistake, not the professional concern of a supervisor whose subordinate has overstepped. The deep, foundational, life-rearranging terror of a man who has just understood that the structure he has been standing on for 22 years has in the last 8 minutes dissolved beneath his feet, and that the ground he thought was solid is not ground at all. He turned toward Pruitt, who was still at the trunk of the Cadillac with the knife open and angled at the attaché case's lockplate, still performing the casual, confident authority of a man who has done this kind of thing 100 times and expects it to end the way it always ends. Miller. The name came out wrong. Pruitt's name was not Miller, and Voss corrected himself, but the slip was telling. His brain was already misallocating resources. Pruitt. Put the knife away. Pruitt looked over his shoulder, eyebrows raised at the tone. He had not heard that particular tone from Voss in 18 years. Sarge. I said, put it away. Voss's voice cracked on the second word. Just slightly. But Pruitt heard it, and the sound of it, his sergeant's voice cracking like a load-bearing wall developing a fracture, was enough to make him lower the knife. Marcus turned his head slowly and looked at Voss. He did not smile. He did not allow any satisfaction to reach his expression. He simply looked at the sergeant with the same dark, patient eyes that had been looking at Pruitt since the window came down, and the look said everything that needed to be said without using a single word. Voss crossed the distance between the cruiser and the trunk of the Cadillac in 3 rapid, uncharacteristically graceless strides, shoved Pruitt back from the case hard enough that the younger officer stumbled and nearly went down on the wet asphalt, and turned to face Marcus Ellison, with his hands hovering in the air at chest level, trembling his face the white of a man whose blood has abruptly decided it would rather be somewhere else. Mr. Washington. Sir, United States. He stopped. Reset. His mouth was working ahead of his brain. Sir, we have run your credentials. Yes, Marcus said. I know. For a fraction of a second, 2 seconds at most, the brief hallucinatory interlude between catastrophe and acceptance, Ronald Voss ran the play in his head. He was a 22-year veteran. He knew how the machinery worked. He knew how situations were processed, documented, categorized, and stored. He knew which parts of the machinery turned easily, and which parts required effort, and which parts with the right application of pressure at the right moments could be made to stop turning altogether. He had been doing it his entire career, and he had never once in 22 years been on the wrong side of it. He looked at the scene. The Cadillac had not been formally impounded. The stop was logged in the CAD system, but CAD reports could be amended. The dashcam footage existed, but dashcam footage had experienced technical difficulties before. Carver was the unknown quantity, brand new, impressionable, still learning which direction the pressure went, but Carver was 14 months in and did not have tenure, and understood presumably the mathematics of loyalty in this particular department. And the man who was handcuffed to the door pillar was wet, standing in the rain, on the side of a dark road, at 11:45 at night. He had not yet called anyone. Voss squared his shoulders. He smoothed his face into something approximating professional regret. He said carefully to Marcus's impassive profile, Mr. Ellison, Sir, there has been a genuinely terrible misunderstanding here tonight, and I take full responsibility for that. This was a mistake. A significant mistake, absolutely, but it is a mistake that can be addressed. The CAD report can be corrected. I will personally have your vehicle detailed to address any damage from the interior search. He paused and then added with the delicate, experienced precision of a man who has offered informal resolutions before, There's no reason for this to go further than the 4 of us on this road. Marcus turned his head to look at Voss. The silence stretched for 3 seconds. Then Marcus said, What you have just described, Sergeant Voss is the destruction of an official police dispatch record. He said it the way a man recites a definition from a textbook without inflection, without emphasis, with the clean precision of someone who has spent his career putting language to actions. And the offer to have my vehicle detailed in exchange for my agreement. Not to report tonight's events constitutes an attempt to bribe a federal official in the performance of his duties. Voss's eyes moved to the cruiser. The dashcam light was on. Had been on since Pruitt activated the lights. The audio recording had been running for 9 minutes. You made that offer? Marcus continued on 3 simultaneous video and audio feeds. Your cruiser's dashcam, Officer Carver's bodycam, and the forward and rear recording system in my vehicle, which has been running continuously since I left the federal building in Atlanta at 10:22 this evening. The color that had not yet finished leaving Voss's face completed its departure. Pruitt, who had recovered his physical footing and was standing to Voss's right, tried the only thing he had left. He straightened up with the effortful bluster of a man reaching for a tool he can feel slipping from his grip. You were crossing the fog line, he said. That's a documentable traffic offense. The stop was legal. Everything else follows from the stop. Marcus looked at him. Officer Pruitt, he said. Turn around, please, and look at the trunk of my car. Pruitt turned. The titanium attaché case sat on the trunk undamaged. The combination lock glinted in the amber light. Pruitt's folding knife lay on the wet asphalt beside the rear tire where it had fallen when Voss shoved him away 4 inches of open steel blade against the dark pavement. There is a blue folder on the top of the stack inside that case, Marcus said. The tab reads, Operation Clean Sweep Count 1A. I want you to understand something about that document, Officer Pruitt. I want you to understand it very clearly because it is going to structure the next several years of your life in ways that I think you should have the opportunity to comprehend before this night ends. He paused, and the pause was not theatrical. It was the pause of a man choosing his words for accuracy rather than effect the pause of a prosecutor who understands that precision is a form of respect even when the thing being said with precision is not respectful. That folder contains a 31-page federal indictment. Your name appears on page 3. Sergeant Voss's name appears on page 2. Together, you are named as primary defendants in a conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law, evidence tampering, perjury, and racketeering charges carrying combined mandatory minimums that would ensure that neither of you leaves a federal penitentiary before you are in your 70s. Pruitt went still, the kind of still that follows impact rather than precedes it. And underneath your names, Marcus continued, is a name that I want you to hear. Darnell Bryce. 22 years old. He spent 28 months in state prison on a weapons charge that your stop manufactured and your testimony supported. My team secured his release 7 weeks ago. His mother's name is Loretta. She is 50 years old. She has worked 2 jobs since her son was arrested to pay his legal fees, and she has not stopped working 2 jobs since he was released because the time he was gone does not give itself back. He looked at Pruitt for a long moment. Loretta Bryce's son is the first person I planned to call in the morning. Before the indictments were filed, before the press release, before anything else, that was going to be the first call. Pruitt's mouth was open, not speaking, just open. The knife that had been in his hand 8 minutes ago might as well have belonged to a different life. His brain was running the calculation of the last 18 years through the filter of what he had just heard, and the calculation was not producing a manageable number. I strongly advise you both, Marcus said, to contact your union representatives tonight, before you speak to anyone else. Voss began to beg. It started carefully with apology, with the language of supervisory accountability, with the register of a man still attempting to operate within the framework of professional protocol. He said that he had not ordered the stop, that Pruitt had initiated it independently, that his own arrival on the scene had been a matter of standard supervisory oversight. He said that the illegal search had been a judgment error in the field, that the marijuana odor pretext had been poorly communicated, that he had not authorized the attempt to open the case and had in fact stopped it. Each of these statements was partially true and entirely beside the point, and Marcus let Voss make them without interruption, because they were being recorded and they were building the evidentiary record for Count 20, the emergency addendum indictment that Marcus was already constructing in the back of his mind. Then Voss's language changed. He mentioned the pension, 2 years away. He had 33 years in the system, 2 more years, and he qualified for full retirement benefits. He mentioned his wife, her name was Karen, and he mentioned with a specificity that suggested he had rehearsed the idea of this conversation without ever expecting to actually be having it, that Karen had been diagnosed with a condition that required ongoing medical treatment, and that the department's health insurance was the mechanism by which that treatment was being funded. He mentioned his daughter, who was 23 and finishing a graduate degree at the University of Georgia, and who could not know what her father had been doing for 22 years because he had been careful to ensure that she did not know, because he had always told himself that he was doing it for the family, for the stability, for the life that a sergeant's salary provided and a terminated sergeant's salary would not. He was on one knee on the wet asphalt before he seemed to realize he had gone down there. The knee of his dark jacket was soaked through immediately, and he did not appear to notice. His hands were clasped together in front of him in a gesture that was not quite prayer and not quite supplication, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between the two. Marcus listened to all of it. He listened with the still complete attentiveness of a man who has learned in 30 years of legal practice that a full accounting of a situation is always more useful than a partial one, and that the most revealing thing a person says is always what they say when they believe there is nothing left to strategize. Then he spoke. "I grew up 4 miles from this road," Marcus said. He did not raise his voice. He did not adopt the prosecutorial register of a man making a closing argument. He spoke in the voice of a person speaking a truth they have lived with for a long time. "My father drove a school bus in this county for 31 years. He drove the routes through Meadowbrook before Meadowbrook was gated, when it was still just residential roads and corner stores. He drove the routes through the parts of Harlow County that did not appear on the realtor brochures. He drove every route with the same careful attention because the children on all of them were the same weight of responsibility to him." He paused. The rain fell. The light bar kept spinning. He was pulled over 43 times in his life. I know the number because he kept a log, not because he was collecting evidence, not because he was building a case, but because he believed that precision in the face of injustice was the only dignified response available to him. 43 times. He was cited once, for a cracked taillight that he had the receipt for replacing 2 days earlier. Marcus looked at Voss on the wet pavement and at Pruitt, standing against the Cadillac with the expression of a man who has stopped being able to perform confidence, and at Carver in the cruiser doorway, who had not moved or spoken in several minutes. "I have spent 11 months building the case that is in this car," Marcus continued. "I have spent 11 months sitting with families in kitchen tables and church halls and community center meeting rooms and listening to what men in uniforms like yours took from them. Not listening the way a lawyer listens, listening the way a person listens. Because Darnell Bryce's mother is not an exhibit. She is a woman who has spent 3 years unable to fully exhale, and I owe her and the 13 others like her the courtesy of understanding what this work actually costs before I ask them to trust me with it." He turned fully to face Pruitt now, the way a man turns when he wants to make certain the other person understands that what follows is addressed specifically to them. "You looked at me tonight and you saw a target. You didn't see a man coming home from work. You didn't see a person with a daughter who left the porch light on. You saw the car and you saw the hour and you saw me, and you decided before a single word was spoken, before a single action was taken, that I was someone you could use to fill whatever need this particular night was failing to satisfy." He paused. "And you were wrong. Not because of who I am professionally. Wrong because I am a citizen of this country on a public road, and that was sufficient. Then, without transition, without softening, Marcus shifted registers. He became the prosecutor. What occurred tonight on this stretch of Harlow County Road constitutes the following federal violations: initiation of a pretextual traffic stop without reasonable articulable suspicion, a violation of the Fourth Amendment and Title 42 of the United States Code, unlawful detention of a federal official in the performance of his duties, illegal search of a vehicle without consent and without valid probable cause, fabrication of probable cause through false statements made on the record, the marijuana odor which adds a perjury component, attempted forced entry into federally protected materials which triggers Title 18, Section 1519, obstruction of a federal investigation, and bribery of a federal official. He turned to Voss. That last one is yours specifically. You offered it on camera. Pruitt's legs buckled. He leaned into the Cadillac hard, and the car moved slightly on its suspension, and Marcus watched the man who had put him in handcuffs 20 minutes ago struggle to remain upright against the weight of the night's arithmetic. Tonight, Marcus said, and his voice dropped to the register of a final statement, the voice used when all the evidence has been entered and the case is complete. You pulled over the man who has been building the case against you for 11 months. You searched his car. You almost opened the briefcase that contained on the top of the stack the indictment with your name on it. He paused one final time. You handed me the 20th count by doing it. Voss stopped being coherent. He had already been on one knee, and he went down to both of them now, and his hands came up in front of him with the quality of a man offering to give something back that he understands too late was never his to have. He was weeping not quietly, not with the restrained, dignified grief of a man taking an accounting of his life, but fully with the raw, ragged quality of sound that comes from a place beyond embarrassment, from the depth of a fear that has finally broken through every professional casing that has been containing it for 22 years. He talked about the pension. He talked about Karen's medical treatment. He talked about his daughter's graduate degree, about the mortgage on the house in Cedar Ridge, about the 22 years of service, about the fact that he had never. This was the specific phrase he used, repeated twice. He had never meant for anyone to actually get hurt. He had been doing what the job required. He had been doing what everyone in his chain of command had always indicated implicitly or explicitly was acceptable and appropriate and professional. Marcus listened to all of it without expression. Pruitt tried one last attempt at the narrative that had sustained him for 18 years. He said the word swerving again, and the word sounded absurd in the wet night air, detached from any context that could support it, a word floating in space with nothing around it. His voice cracked on the second syllable. Marcus did not address the word directly. He simply asked Pruitt to think carefully about what the dashcam footage from the last 11 minutes would show when reviewed by a federal magistrate's office in the morning. Pruitt stopped trying. Carver, who had been standing in the cruiser doorway since Voss went to the laptop, finally stepped fully out of the vehicle. He walked toward Marcus, not toward Voss or Pruitt, and his face had the gray, stripped-down quality of a young man who has had something explained to him that cannot be unexplained. He stopped a few feet from Marcus and stood with his hands at his sides. "I'm sorry," Carver said. It was directed at Marcus plainly, without qualification or self-protective caveat. It was perhaps the first thing anyone had said on that road all night that was free of strategy. Marcus looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow." Then he said to Voss from above the kneeling sergeant, "You are going to use your radio to contact Captain Glenn Whitfield. You are going to ask him to come to this location. You will tell him exactly who is standing on this road and exactly what has happened. If you decline to make that call, my next call will be to the FBI Field Office Duty Supervisor, and I will report an active kidnapping and assault by officers impersonating lawful authority. You have 60 seconds. Voss, from his knees in the rain, reached for the radio on his shoulder. His hand was shaking so badly that he double-pressed the transmit button twice before the channel opened. Captain Glenn Whitfield arrived in 14 minutes. His unmarked black Tahoe came out of the fog without sirens, a silent, deliberate approach that suggested a man who had been briefed on what he was driving toward and had decided somewhere on the road between his house and this shoulder that sirens would be an announcement he did not want to make. He parked nose to nose with Voss's personal truck and sat in the vehicle for perhaps 30 seconds before the door opened. Whitfield was 58 years old. He was a tall man, spare, with the kind of physical economy that comes from a lifetime of self-discipline, not athletic exactly, but contained every part of him accounted for. He was wearing a department jacket over a dark sweater and slacks hastily assembled over what had clearly been a home evening. His silver hair was damp at the edges. He stepped out of the Tahoe and took in the scene with the eyes of a man who has processed a great many scenes in 30 years and has learned that the first 10 seconds of looking are worth more than any subsequent explanation. He saw Marcus Ellison standing at the trunk of the Cadillac, the titanium attaché case beside him, his wool suit soaked through the marks of the cuffs still visible as faint red lines at his wrists. Voss off to the side, no longer on his knees, but with the posture of a man recently removed from a kneeling position, his face a disaster. Pruitt leaning against the Cadillac with the blank-eyed stillness of a man in shock. Carver standing apart from both of them near the cruiser. And on the wet asphalt, a folding knife. Whitfield had been briefed on Marcus Ellison. The entire command staff of the 15th Precinct had been briefed 3 weeks earlier via a confidential memorandum from the county sheriff's office that a DOJ civil rights investigation was active in their jurisdiction and that all personnel were expected to conduct themselves by the highest standard of professional and constitutional practice. The memorandum had not named Marcus specifically. It had not needed to. The information had circulated through the precinct's informal channels, the way information always circulated in precincts, and within a week, most of the senior officers knew the investigation's name and the general scope of its concern. Whitfield had on 2 separate occasions since receiving that memo directly addressed Voss about the need for his unit to exercise particular care during the investigation period. Voss had nodded both times. Pruitt had not been in either conversation, but the expectation of compliance had been communicated through the chain of command. Clearly, the chain of command had not held. Whitfield walked past Voss and Pruitt without acknowledgement and stopped in front of Marcus. He extended his right hand. "Mr. Ellison, I'm Captain Whitfield. I cannot adequately express." Marcus looked at the extended hand. He did not take it. He let his gaze move from the hand to Whitfield's face, and the quality of the look was not hostile. It was simply the look of a man declining an offer that does not address the situation at hand. Whitfield lowered the hand. "I understand," he said, and the statement was oddly accurate in its simplicity. "This is not an internal affairs matter," Marcus said. "I want to be very clear about that. This is not a supervisory conversation. This is a federal crime scene, and I am the lead prosecutor of the investigation that was operating out of that case." He gestured toward the attaché case. "What happened tonight will be documented and filed as an emergency addendum to the pending indictments. That filing will happen at 8 a.m. tomorrow, regardless of any action taken tonight." Whitfield absorbed this. His jaw tightened slightly. He turned to look at Voss and Pruitt with a fury that was not entirely manufactured for Marcus's benefit. A genuine fury, the fury of a man watching the consequences of his institutional failure arrive in the most public and irrevocable way possible. "Is this true?" His voice was low and precise. "Did you attempt to force open a federal prosecutor's case?" Pruitt made the mistake of answering honestly. The stress of the night and the systematic collapse of every narrative he had tried to maintain had stripped away his capacity for strategic self-protection, and what came out of his mouth was the rawest, most undefended version of his actual reasoning. He said that Marcus had been driving a $100,000 car at midnight. He said that Marcus had fit the profile. The silence that followed that sentence lasted 4 seconds. Carver, standing near the cruiser, closed his eyes briefly. He had heard Pruitt say those words, and he had watched them land in the air between Pruitt and the federal prosecutor and the captain, and he understood immediately and with complete clarity what those words would mean when they appeared, and they would appear. They were on 3 recording devices in a federal court proceeding. Marcus said, "Thank you, Officer Pruitt." His voice was entirely neutral. "You just made my job considerably less complex." Whitfield ran his hand over his face, a single slow motion that communicated the understanding of a man who has just watched a door close on an entire chapter of his professional life. Marcus reached into the inside breast pocket of his suit jacket and produced a small brass key. He inserted it into the secondary key cylinder on the attaché case. He turned it once heard the cylinder release, then entered the combination with 3 practiced turns of the numbered dial. The lock clicked open cleanly and silently, the mechanism functioning with the quiet precision of something designed and built to work exactly the way it was supposed to work. The contrast with the image of Pruitt's knife angled at the same lock 5 minutes earlier needed no commentary. He lifted the lid. Inside, 19 sealed blue folders were organized in numbered order, precisely aligned. The top folder, labeled with a tab that read, in block capital letters, Operation Clean Sweep. Count 1-, a Harlow County Sheriff's Department. 15th Precinct. Defendants Voss Ronald T./Pruitt. Craig D. Marcus removed the folder and held it up in the rain. He let Whitfield read the tab. He let the captain register what the folder contained, what the label meant, what its presence in this case, in this car, on this road, at this hour meant, in terms of how completely and catastrophically the night's events had rearranged themselves. These indictments were scheduled to be filed tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, Marcus said. I drove them from the federal building myself because I did not want them out of my personal custody for the last 12 hours before filing. I was 3 miles from home when Officer Pruitt activated his lights. He paused. The knife mark on the lock plate of this case, which I expect is visible under forensic examination, will be photographed and documented. It will appear in the emergency addendum as physical evidence of the attempted tampering. He looked at Voss, who had not moved since Whitfield arrived. Voss was standing slightly apart from Pruitt now, a physical distance that had opened up over the course of the last few minutes, the natural geometry of 2 men who are beginning to understand that their interests may no longer be aligned. Sergeant Voss, Marcus said, "Your name is on page 2 of this document. It has been there for 6 months. Everything you did tonight is going on page 32. Voss made a sound. Not a word, a sound, something between a breath and a syllable that his body produced independently of his will. His legs did not buckle this time, but his shoulders dropped by 1.5 inches in a single motion that looked like the structural settling of something heavy being placed on a surface that was not built to bear it. Pruitt beside him simply stopped looking at anything. His eyes moved to some middle distance beyond the shoulder of the road and stayed there unfocused, as though the visual world had become temporarily irrelevant. Marcus placed the folder back in the case. He pressed the lid closed. The lock clicked. "Officer Carver." Carver straightened. His response was instinctive. A young officer hearing his name from an authority that outranked the authority that had trained him, the instinct of a man who has been conditioned to respond and whose conditioning tonight was being redirected. "Yes, sir." Marcus looked at him for a moment, a direct, assessing look, the look of a man who has spent 30 years reading people in rooms where stakes are high and performance is universal and genuine character is rare and worth recognizing when it appears. "You did not initiate this stop," Marcus said. "When Sergeant Voss ordered the search, you expressed hesitation once on the recording before complying. You did not participate in the fabrication of the odor pretext. And you were the officer who ran my credentials and reported the results accurately and immediately." Carver was very still. "I'm not offering you this information to make you comfortable," Marcus continued. "I'm offering it because it is accurate, and because accuracy is the foundation of every offer I make. Tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., you will present yourself at the Department of Justice field office in downtown Atlanta. You will ask for Special Agent Marla Covington, who is the coordinating federal agent for Operation Clean Sweep. You will provide a full, unredacted sworn statement of everything you witnessed tonight and everything you have witnessed during your 14 months under this command." He paused. Everything. The quotas, the stops that didn't make the log, the language Sergeant Voss used to describe which areas of the county were being actively patrolled. Everything. "If you do this, your cooperation will be formally noted in the investigation record, and you will be treated as a cooperating witness, not a co-conspirator. Your career will not be over." He let the second possibility rest unspoken for a moment. "If you do not appear tomorrow morning, you will be named in the emergency addendum as a co-conspirator in tonight's events, and the question of what you knew and when you knew it will be decided by a federal grand jury rather than by a conversation between professionals." Carver nodded. The motion was not reluctant or strategic. It was the simple, slightly exhausted nod of a young man who has spent 14 months in a state of mounting, unaddressed moral discomfort and has just been handed by the least expected person a door that opens in the right direction. 7 o'clock, he said. "I'll be there." The tears that had appeared at the edges of his eyes while Marcus was speaking did not spill over. He blinked them back with the controlled effort of a young man who understands that crying right now in front of these particular people on this particular road would not serve the version of himself he was choosing to be from this moment forward. Marcus nodded once and looked away because there was no reason to make the moment harder than it needed to be. Marcus addressed Captain Whitfield directly for the second and final time on the shoulder of that road. "Captain, I need you to relieve Officers Voss and Pruitt of their service weapons and their shields, right now on this scene before any of us leaves this road." Whitfield looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man measuring the request against the only alternatives available. The measurement did not take long. "If you don't do it," Marcus said without impatience, "my next call is to the FBI field office duty supervisor. I will report an active obstruction of a federal investigation and request an emergency response. The tactical team will be here in approximately 20 minutes, and the removal of their weapons and credentials will happen in front of whatever traffic is on this road at midnight on their body cams and will almost certainly be on local news before 6 a.m. Whitfield turned to his men. The look on his face was not compassion, and it was not professional regret. It was the look of a man who has been in this institution long enough to understand that the institution's survival, his survival within it, required a complete and public disavowal of what he was looking at right now. He had warned Voss. He had warned him twice. The warning had not been heeded, and now the captain of the 15th Precinct was standing on a dark road in the rain at midnight, performing the most formal act of institutional disavowal available to him, stripping the weapons and shields from 2 senior officers, while a federal prosecutor watched. "Stand up," he said to Voss. The order was flat and devoid of the seniority and familiarity of 22 years of shared service. "Give me your belt." Voss stood. He did not move toward compliance immediately. There was a final moment, 2 or 3 seconds in which the entirety of a 22-year career seemed to pass through some interior accounting, and then the moment passed, and his hands moved to his duty belt with the thick, uncoordinated slowness of a man doing something his nervous system has not been asked to do before. He unbuckled the belt. It dropped. The Glock 22 and the Taser X26P and the spare magazines and the collapsible baton and the handcuff case all hit the wet asphalt together with a heavy composite thud that sounded precisely like what it was, the weight of 2 decades of authority landing on the ground and staying there. He reached up to his uniform jacket. His fingers found the silver shield, the shield that read Sergeant R. Voss/Harlow Company. SD/15th Precinct. The the shield he had worn since 2002 and had worn as the first officer in his family, and had made sure his daughter held once when she was 7 years old and visiting his unit for a father-daughter day at the precinct. He unpinned it. He placed it into Whitfield's open palm. Pruitt did not offer his belt voluntarily. Whitfield had to reach forward and unhook the retention clasp himself, and Pruitt stood with his arms slightly away from his sides and his face aimed at the middle distance, while the captain removed his sidearm and equipment with the precise, impersonal movements of a man cataloging evidence rather than managing a human moment. The badge came last. Whitfield pulled it from Pruitt's chest with a clean single motion, and Pruitt flinched at the tug, the way a person flinches when something is removed that they did not realize had been holding something else in place. "You are both suspended without pay, effective immediately," Whitfield said, pending federal charges. "You will not return to the precinct. You will not contact any member of the department. You will not speak to the press. You will not speak to each other about the events of tonight. You will wait separately for federal agents to contact you." He looked at them both for one moment. "The lawyers," he added quietly, "should be the very first call you make when you get home." Marcus watched all of this from beside the Cadillac. He did not move. He did not speak. He stood with his hands at his sides, the attaché case on the trunk beside him, and watched the machinery of accountability perform slowly and imperfectly, and very late the function it was built for. Then he picked up the case, walked around the car to the driver's door, opened it, and placed the case carefully back onto the rear seat. He adjusted it so it was sitting straight and secured, and he locked it, and the lock clicked with the same clean, certain sound it had made when he locked it 3 hours ago in the federal building. He got in the car. He started the engine. He put it in drive. He did not look in the rearview mirror as he pulled back onto the road. The sun had not yet cleared the horizon when the first armored vehicle turned onto the access road of the Harlow County Sheriff's Department 15th Precinct. It was a matte black FBI Suburban, the kind that absorbed streetlight rather than reflecting it, the kind that arrived without announcement and required none. Behind it came 3 more, then a white van with federal plates, then a vehicle marked U.S. Marshal Services in reflective yellow, then 2 more Suburbans, and finally a command vehicle larger than the others that parked diagonally across the precinct's visitor lot with the geometry of finality. Doors opened in unison. The agents who emerged wore olive tactical vests with FBI stenciled in yellow across the front and back, and they moved with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had rehearsed this entry because they had known for months that it was coming and had wanted it to go correctly. No sirens, no theatrical announcements, just the mechanical, organized purposefulness of a federal operation that had been in preparation since August and was now concluding in November at 5:55 in the morning before the early shift had finished its first cups of coffee. The precinct's morning skeleton crew had approximately 45 seconds between when they saw the vehicles in the parking lot and when the doors opened. It was not enough time to do anything except stand very still. The agents secured the server room first. Then the evidence locker sealed, documented a federal evidence log opened on the spot by a DOJ forensic accountant who had been waiting for this morning since July. The file cabinets in the administrative section were photographed, numbered, and boxed. The individual officer mailboxes were photographed. The scheduling board, which showed Pruitt and Voss both listed as currently suspended and removed from rotation, a notation Whitfield had apparently added in the small hours of the morning, was photographed. The tactical commander moved through the precinct with the quiet authority of someone operating on a warrant signed by a federal judge, which is the only kind of authority that does not require negotiation with whoever is standing in the way. 11 simultaneous arrest warrants were being executed at 11 separate residential addresses across Harlow County at the same moment. Ronald Voss lived in a split-level house on Pembroke Circle in the Cedar Ridge development 6 miles from the precinct. The federal marshals arrived at his address at 5:58 a.m., 12 minutes before his wife's alarm was set to go off. They knocked, once announced their presence and their authority, and Voss answered the door in the clothes he had been wearing on the road. He had apparently not changed, had perhaps not gone to bed at all, had spent the hours since midnight sitting with the weight of the night in whatever configuration a person sits with a weight like that. He was cuffed on his front porch under the first gray light of the morning, on the same lawn where his daughter had learned to ride a bicycle, and where he had shoveled snow on winter mornings for 16 years. His neighbor across the street turned a light on behind their blinds. Another neighbor's dog began to bark. Craig Pruitt lived in a brick ranch-style house 2 blocks from the county line. He was in the kitchen when the marshals arrived, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee he had not yet drunk. The spearmint gum was still in his jacket pocket, the same jacket, the same gum, the small circular tin he had been carrying since the previous summer. He was cuffed at 6:02 a.m., and walked to the transport van past his own cruiser, which was parked in the driveway because he had driven it home from the road and had apparently not yet thought through the implications of having done that. The dashcam unit was still in it. The recording was still on the hard drive. The agents cataloged and seized the vehicle on the spot. By 7 o'clock in the morning, 9 of the 11 named officers had been taken into federal custody without incident. One had retained legal counsel by 6 a.m. and surrendered through his attorney's office. One had not been at his registered home address and was located by noon at his mother's house 40 miles north of the county line. Inside the federal building in downtown Atlanta, at the DOJ field office on the 7th floor, Danny Carver arrived at 6:58 a.m. He was 2 minutes early. He was wearing civilian clothes, a dark blue jacket, clean jeans, a white shirt. He had showered and shaved, and the effort of that preparation on a night when he presumably had not slept was its own kind of statement. He asked the security desk for Special Agent Marla Covington and was told she was expecting him. He was in the deposition room for 7 hours and 11 minutes. He did not stop once. He told Special Agent Covington and the 2 DOJ attorneys seated across from him everything, the quotas, the language Voss used when describing which neighborhoods to actively patrol and which to leave alone. The specific nights he had watched Pruitt conduct stops that he knew had no legal foundation. The stops that did not appear in the CAD logs, the evidence locker inconsistencies he had noticed and been told to ignore by Voss in his 3rd month on the job. He told them about a Friday night in March when he had been in the passenger seat during a stop on the Eastern County Road, and Pruitt had found nothing in the car and had gone to the trunk of his cruiser and had come back with a small evidence bag that he logged against the stop, and Carver had not asked what was in it because he had been afraid of what the answer would tell him about himself if he asked it and already knew. He told them about that. He sat across a conference table in a federal building on a Tuesday morning and told them about it, and the telling had the quality of something that had been building pressure for 14 months and was now releasing through the only opening available. When the deposition was complete, Special Agent Covington thanked him and told him that his cooperation had been formally recorded and that the DOJ's position on his individual culpability, given the scope and the candor of his statement, would be provided in writing within 72 hours. Carver thanked her. He walked out of the building into the November morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with his face tilted slightly upward, the way a person stands when they need a moment of sky. Then he got in his car and drove home, and for the first time since the summer, the knot that had been living in his sternum for 14 months was not as tight as it had been. Walt Decker, the senior representative for the Harlow County Police Benevolent Association, arrived at the federal building at 9:15 a.m. for a scheduled review of the discovery materials released to the defense's preliminary counsel. He was a compact, experienced man who had spent 20 years protecting officers from the consequences of their choices with the same professional commitment that other lawyers brought to corporate defense or personal injury law. He had won difficult cases. He had navigated difficult situations. He had the particular weathered confidence of a man who has learned that most situations properly managed have more exit routes than they initially appear to contain. He sat with the discovery file for 2 hours. Then he requested a private call with Captain Whitfield. On the call, Decker used the word radioactive twice. He explained that the scope of the documentation, the 11 months of investigation materials, the forensic financial analysis, the evidence locker, discrepancies. The corroborating testimony of multiple witnesses, including an active DOJ official with personal documented physically recorded experience of the defendant's conduct, placed this case in his professional assessment entirely outside the range of situations that the PBA's bylaws authorized it to fund a defense for. The bylaws specified, as did most such associations, that union resources were available for officers acting within the lawful scope of their duties. In his considered opinion, what Voss and Pruitt had done, and what Carver's testimony detailed as the context for what Voss and Pruitt had done, did not constitute actions taken within the lawful scope of their duties. The PBA was formally withdrawing representation from both defendants by noon. Whitfield, for his part, had spent the morning in a 12-hour cooperative session with DOJ investigators, producing 3 years of internal affairs files that had been administratively classified as pending review, which was the department's terminology for files that were intended to stay pending review indefinitely and to progress no further. The files contained 31 civilian complaints against Pruitt and 22 against Voss, the vast majority of them marked unfounded after internal review, a review process that, as Carver's deposition and the financial forensics would later demonstrate, had been conducted by the same supervisory structure that had an interest in the complaints remaining unfounded. Whitfield was not named in the current indictments. That fact was not an accident. It reflected a deliberate investigative decision by Marcus's team based on an assessment of Whitfield's conduct that distinguished between a supervisor who had failed to act with sufficient urgency and a supervisor who had actively participated in the criminal enterprise. Whether that distinction would remain intact through the broader investigation was not guaranteed, and Whitfield understood this. His cooperation was accordingly thorough and unreserved. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the architecture of a 22-year institutional corruption had been exposed from foundation to roof, and the people who had been maintaining it had been separated into 3 categories: those who were in federal custody, those who were cooperating, and those who were waiting for their lawyers to tell them which of the first 2 options was still available to them. On the afternoon of the federal operation, as the news broke on local television and was picked up by the wire services and began moving through the information channels that carry these stories, the phones in Marcus's office began to ring. By 5 p.m., there were 14 calls logged, each from a person or a family member of a person whose conviction was connected to a stop or an evidence submission associated with Craig Pruitt or Ronald Voss. The calls came from attorneys, from social workers, from community organizations that had been tracking these cases for years. They came from the families themselves, mothers, brothers, wives, and in 2 cases the men themselves, calling from numbers that were tagged in the case management system with the notation prior contact documentation in file. 14 people whose lives had been restructured by the operation of a legal system that had been used as a tool for something other than what it was built for. 14 people who had spent months or years navigating the consequences of evidence that had been manufactured, of probable cause that had been invented, of documentation that had been constructed after the fact by men who understood that the construction required only access and vocabulary and the reasonable expectation that no one would look too closely. The most significant of these calls, from the perspective of what it represented in human terms, came at 6:17 p.m. from a number that appeared in the case management system under the notation Bryce Loretta M. Priority Contact Case File. 14A. Loretta Bryce was 50 years old. She lived in a 2-bedroom house in the Calder Park neighborhood of Harlow County, the neighborhood where Marcus had grown up and where his father had driven the school bus route for 31 years. She worked at a hospital laundry facility on the Tuesday through Saturday morning shift and at a dry cleaner on Monday and Friday afternoons, and she had been working both jobs since the week after her son Darnell was arrested 3 years ago, because the legal fees required for adequate representation cost more than her single income could absorb, and she had made the decision without drama and without hesitation that she would work more rather than provide less. She had called Marcus's office twice during the investigation, both times to ask whether there was progress and whether her cooperation with investigators was still needed. Marcus had spoken to her personally both times, which was not standard practice for a prosecutor at his level, and which he had done anyway, because Loretta Bryce was not a case management notation. She was a woman who had spent 3 years unable to fully exhale. When her number appeared on the caller ID at 6:17, Marcus picked up the phone himself. She said, "I saw the news." He said, "Yes." There was a pause of several seconds during which neither of them spoke, and the silence contained more than most spoken exchanges. She said, "Are they really?" He said, "Yes." She made a sound. Not a word. Not quite crying. Something more fundamental than either of those things, the sound a person makes when a weight they have been carrying for so long, they have forgotten what it was like to not carry it, is removed, not gradually, but all at once, and the body registers the absence before the mind does. Marcus held the phone and listened to the sound and did not say anything because there was nothing to say, because this was not a moment that required legal expertise or prosecutorial skill or any of the professional capabilities he had spent his career developing. This was a moment that required only the willingness to be present for it, and he had that, and he stayed on the line until the silence on the other end settled into something quieter and more resolved. "You said you would call me first," she said finally. "I got a little detained last night," he said. She made a different sound, then something involuntary halfway between recognition and something harder, and Marcus allowed himself very briefly the private acknowledgement that the sentence he had just spoken was among the most precisely accurate things he had ever said in his professional life. "Can I come?" she asked. "To the courthouse." "When it happens." "I'll have a seat held for you in the gallery," Marcus said. First row. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was built in the 1940s in the architectural language of institutional authority, granite and marble, and polished mahogany ceilings high enough to make the people moving beneath them feel the appropriate scale of what was happening. The intended communication being that this was not a place for small matters, and that the matters addressed here would be addressed with the full, unhurried weight of the Republic's legal apparatus. Courtroom 6B was on the 4th floor. On a Thursday morning in late August, 9 months after the traffic stop on County Road 9, it was full to the last seat. The case of United States versus Ronald T. Voss and Craig D. Pruitt had been covered by the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Washington Post, 3 national civil rights organizations, and a documentary production company that had been filming the Operation Clean Sweep investigation for 7 months with DOJ authorization. The gallery contained members of each of those organizations, as well as legal scholars from 2 Atlanta area law schools, 3 representatives from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the families. 14 families, taking up roughly a third of the available seating. In the front row of the gallery on the left side, Loretta Bryce sat with her hands folded in her lap. She was wearing a dark green dress, and her hair was done the way she had described to Marcus in their last preparation conversation as Sunday clothes for a Tuesday that matters. Darnell sat beside her, 22 years old, the same person he had been at 19, and also not at all the same person, having spent 28 months navigating an experience that nobody comes through unchanged. He was quiet and still in the way of a person who has learned that stillness has uses that movement does not, and he watched the defense table with the measured, patient attention of someone who has been waiting a long time for this room and intends to be fully present in it. At the defense table, Voss and Pruitt were unrecognizable. The uniforms, the equipment, the shields, the swagger that physical authority creates when it is worn long enough. All of it was gone, replaced by the particular institutional drabness of federal pretrial detention. They had been held without bail for 9 months on the grounds that as active law enforcement officers with detailed knowledge of the investigative structure, they represented a flight risk and a risk to potential witnesses, their lawyers, public defenders. Both of them, the PBA having withdrawn and the private attorneys they had initially retained having concluded, after reviewing the discovery file, that adequate preparation for this case required resources their clients could not provide, sat beside them with the resigned professionalism of people doing their best in circumstances that did not reward optimism. Voss had developed a tremor in his hands during the 9 months of detention. It was visible when his hands rested on the defense table, a fine, constant trembling that made him look at 51 much older than he was. Pruitt sat beside him with the fixed, unfocused gaze of a man who had been staring at the same interior wall for 9 months and had found behind it nothing that helped him understand how this had happened. At the prosecution table, Marcus Ellison was dressed in a charcoal pinstripe suit. Not the same suit from the road which had been dry cleaned and pressed and hung back in his closet, and which he had decided after some thought not to wear to this proceeding, because the gesture would be theatrical, and theater was not something this case needed. He sat with his legal pads organized before him and his pen uncapped, and the titanium attaché case. The same case, the scratch on the lock plate still visible under fluorescent light, positioned on the table to his right. He had argued the case himself over the objections of the defense, which had filed 2 motions challenging his personal standing to prosecute, given his role as a complainant and a witness. Judge Sandra Hollis, 61, had denied both motions. In her written rulings, she had noted that, while the prosecutor's presence at the scene was unusual, the evidentiary value of his direct knowledge of the defendant's conduct, fully documented on 3 independent recording systems, was not grounds for disqualification, and that the DOJ's institutional standing to prosecute remained unaffected by the individual identity of the lead counsel. Judge Hollis was known in federal legal circles as precise, patient, and entirely intolerant of procedural theater. She had been appointed to the federal bench at 42 after a career as a public defender that had given her, in her own words, a detailed and permanent understanding of what the system looks like from the receiving end. She had presided over 4 major police misconduct cases in her time on the federal bench. Her sentencing decisions in those cases had been cited in legal scholarship and in every argument for structural accountability reform filed in the 11th Circuit in the preceding decade. The trial ran 16 days. On the 16th day, Marcus rose from the prosecution table. He buttoned his jacket. He smoothed the front of it with his right hand. He picked up the titanium attaché case and walked with it to the center of the courtroom, and he set it on the podium with a single definitive motion, and the thud of it against the wood was the sound of 11 months of work arriving at its final public expression. He did not open the case. He rested both hands on it lightly and looked at the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. His voice was the voice he always used in closing, not theatrical, not performing, but resonant and fully present, the voice of a person addressing other people directly about something that matters. For 16 days you have heard testimony, reviewed evidence, watched footage, and read documents. I am not going to use these final minutes to walk you through what you have already absorbed. You understand the facts. You understand the law. What I want to do in the time I have is tell you something that the facts and the law do not quite capture on their own." He paused. "A year ago, I drove home from work on a county road 3 miles from my house. I had been working for 14 hours. I had a case in the back seat of my car that represented 11 months of investigation, hundreds of hours of evidence review, and the testimonies of 14 men and women whose lives had been altered beyond their consent by the 2 men sitting at that table." He did not gesture at the defense table. He did not look at it. His eyes stayed on the jury. "I was pulled over. I was handcuffed against my own car in the rain. I was searched without consent. I was told by one of those men that the case on my trunk needed to be opened and a knife was produced to accomplish that. And I stood on the side of a road at midnight with the cold steel of handcuffs around my wrists, and I waited." He lifted his hands briefly from the attaché case, and the faint, healed-over lines at his wrists were visible for a moment in the courtroom light. Not dramatic, not pronounced, simply there. The residue of a specific night on a specific road. He placed his hands back down. "I did not wait because I was afraid," he said. "I waited because I understood with complete and detailed clarity what was happening. I had been understanding it in professional and personal terms for 30 years, and I waited because I knew that every second of what was happening was being recorded, and that the record was the only tool available to me that could address the situation in a manner that outlasted the moment." He left the podium. He walked slowly toward the jury box. "The men who put those handcuffs on me did not know who I was. That is the truth, and I want you to hold it. They did not know. They looked at a black man in an expensive car at midnight, and they made a decision quickly, reflexively, with the ease of a judgment that had been made so many times before that it no longer felt like a judgment that I was someone whose rights were flexible, someone whose dignity was negotiable, someone who fit a profile." He stopped in front of the jury box. Officer Pruitt said those exact words, in front of his captain, on 3 recording devices. You have heard them. He fit the profile. And I want you to understand what that phrase means in the context of 31 civilian complaints over 18 years, 22 complaints against his supervisor, and 14 cases, 14 human lives in which the same mechanism was applied to the same population with the same result. That phrase is not an error. It is a method, and the men at that table were very good at it. He walked back to the podium. He rested his hands on the attaché case. They were not incompetent officers. They were not rogue actors operating outside the norms of their department because the 31 complaints that were marked unfounded and the 30 years of combined service that produced no disciplinary record tell you something important about the norms of their department. They were effective within the frame of what the department had been measuring and ignoring and enabling and protecting. His voice dropped, and the courtroom went very quiet. "These men didn't fail at their jobs," he said. "They were very good at their jobs. They just weren't doing the job you gave them." He let that sentence sit in the room for 4 full seconds. The job you gave them, the job sworn to in a public oath, the job funded by every taxpayer in this county, the job that exists because communities require protection and have decided to formalize that protection through public institutions and public accountability. That job requires something that the defendants, by every piece of evidence in this record, decided very early in their careers was optional. That job requires the equal application of constitutional protection to every person on every road, regardless of what they look like or what they drive or what time of night it is. He opened the attaché case. He removed the blue folder, Count 1A, and held it up. "I was driving home from finalizing these documents the night they put me in handcuffs. I had the indictments with their names on them in the case they tried to pry open with a knife. The irony is not poetic. It is not cosmic. It is not the universe delivering a moral lesson." He set the folder down. It is the completely predictable outcome of what happens when arrogance becomes so total that it can no longer perceive its own exposure. They did not stop a random citizen. They stopped the man who had spent 11 months documenting exactly what they did to me that night. They handed me the 20th count by doing it. He closed the case. "You have seen the footage. You have heard the testimony. You have reviewed the documents. You know what happened on County Road 9 at 11:37 p.m. on a Tuesday night in November. You know what happened in the evidence locker over 3 years. You know what happened to Darnell Bryce and the 13 others." He looked at the jury, each of them one by one, the full sweep of the box. "These men abused the power that you, through your taxes, through your civic participation, through your collective decision to have a police department, gave them. They used it as a weapon rather than a shield, and they used it against the people it was specifically designed to protect. Now they must answer to those people." He stepped back. We ask that you find the defendants guilty on all counts." He returned to the prosecution table and sat down. The courtroom was silent for approximately 12 seconds, which is a long time for a room full of people who have been holding their breath. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 41 minutes. This was, as the legal reporters in the gallery noted in their dispatches, extraordinarily swift for a multi-count federal RICO case with this volume of documentary evidence. The standard deliberation period for a case of this complexity ranged from 2 days to 2 weeks. The brevity of the jury's deliberation communicated before the verdict was read what the verdict was going to be, not because brevity always signals certainty, but because in this case, with 16 days of evidence, 3 independent video recordings, 7 hours of cooperating witness testimony, forensic financial analysis, and a federal prosecutor who had been personally present at and personally subjected to the conduct in question, the deliberation did not require extended synthesis. The jury knew. They had known for some time. The 3 hours and 41 minutes was the time required to complete the formal procedural steps required by federal law for the documentation of a verdict, not the time required to reach one. When the foreperson stood, the courtroom was so still that the sound of her chair moving was audible in the back row. She read each count separately as the law required, giving each one its full legal name and its full legal weight. Conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law. Guilty. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Title: 18 Section 242 multiple counts. Guilty on each count. Aggravated perjury for the false testimony regarding fog line crossing and marijuana odor filed as a separate criminal charge after the dashcam evidence was introduced. Guilty. Obstruction of a federal investigation stemming from the attempted forced entry into the attaché case. Guilty. Racketeering under RICO for the evidence planting scheme over 3 years. Guilty. Evidence tampering for the manipulation of evidence locker records. Guilty. With each guilty that entered the room, Voss sank fractionally lower in his chair as though the word had a physical weight that was accumulating on his shoulders. Pruitt did not move. He sat completely still throughout the entire reading, and the stillness was not composed. It was the stillness of a man in whom all voluntary movement has temporarily suspended, waiting for the verdict to finish delivering what the last 9 months had been promising. When the final guilty landed, Pruitt buried his face in his hands. The gallery did not erupt. It did not applaud or shout. The people who had come to this room for this moment were people who had learned through extended experience that expressions of relief and vindication have nowhere to go in a federal courtroom, and they held themselves to the decorum of the room even as the things they had been holding for months and years found finally a container to release into. In the first row, Loretta Bryce sat with her hands still folded in her lap, exactly as she had sat since the proceeding began. She did not move when the verdict was read. She closed her eyes for approximately 4 seconds. When she opened them, they were wet, but she was not crying. She was past that, through the grief and out the other side into something that did not have a common name, something that resembled the sensation of a decades-long question being answered. Darnell put his arm around her shoulders. Judge Hollis moved directly to sentencing, which she had the authority to do, given the pre-sentencing reports that had been prepared over the preceding weeks. She looked down from the bench at Voss and Pruitt for a long moment before speaking. The look was not theatrical. She was not performing judicial gravity. She was simply looking at the men in front of her, with the full attentive focus of a person who believes that the individuals being sentenced deserve at minimum the acknowledgement of being seen clearly by the person determining their fate. "You took a solemn oath," she began, and her voice, amplified by the courtroom's acoustics, was measured and completely controlled. "You made a public promise in front of witnesses to uphold the Constitution of the United States, to protect the people of this county without regard for who they were, or what they looked like, or what they drove." She paused. "You decided that oath was conditional. You decided it applied to the people you chose to apply it to, and that the rest were available for other purposes. She leaned forward slightly over the bench. "I have been on this bench for 19 years. I have presided over cases of this nature before. And what I want to say to you, both of you, before I pronounce this sentence, is something I want you to hear clearly and carry with you." She paused, and the pause was not dramatic. It was the pause of someone choosing their words carefully, because the words are going to remain in the room long after the proceeding is over. "You operated under the assumption that the people in this county were beneath accountability, that they could be managed and manipulated and disappeared into the machinery of a system you had learned to operate for your own purposes. You were wrong. Accountability found you on a dark road at 11:37 at night, and it was wearing a suit." The gallery was silent enough that the air seemed to have stopped moving. "Ronald Thomas Voss and Craig David Pruitt, on the charges as found by the jury of your peers, I sentence you each to 24 years and 22 years respectively in a federal correctional institution. These sentences are to be served consecutively without the possibility of parole. Your municipal pensions are stripped under the forfeiture provisions applicable to public employees convicted of federal corruption offenses. The civil liability protections previously afforded to you as county employees are lifted, and the 14 civil suits currently pending against your estates for the victims of the conduct documented in this case are unsealed and authorized to proceed." She looked at them one final time. "This court is adjourned." The gavel came down. The sound of it filled the room, a single definitive crack against the sound block. The clean mechanical finality of a door being closed, and then the federal marshals were moving, and Voss and Pruitt were being lifted to their feet, and the handcuffs were being applied with the same practiced, precise motion that Craig Pruitt had applied to Marcus Ellison's wrists on a rain-slicked shoulder on a Tuesday night 9 months ago. The sound was the same. The steel click, the ratcheting engagement of the locking mechanism, the slight tension of the cuff finding its position, it was exactly the same sound. Every person in that room who had heard the dashcam audio knew that it was the same sound. Pruitt's eyes, as the marshals turned him, moved to the prosecution table. Marcus was standing gathering his legal pads, returning his pen to his jacket pocket. He did not look up immediately. When he did look up, unhurried, his movements completely ordinary, the movements of a man concluding a task that is finished, his eyes met Pruitt's for a period of approximately 2 seconds. Marcus did not smile. He did not nod. He did not allow any expression of triumph or vindication to reach his face, because this was not a moment for triumph and had never been one. He simply looked at Pruitt with the same clear, patient eyes that had been looking at him since the window of the Cadillac came down, and then he looked away and reached for the attaché case. The marshals led Voss and Pruitt toward the side door. Their footsteps in the thin-soled institutional shoes of the federally detained made a quiet, shuffling sound against the marble floor. When they reached the door and the door swung open and they stepped through it, they were walking toward a world that would contain them for the next 2 decades, a world of concrete and routine and the specific total absence of the power and the latitude and the identity that the badge had given them, and without which, as they were about to discover in permanent and irreversible detail, they were simply 2 middle-aged men with nothing holding them up. The door closed behind them. Marcus walked out of the federal courthouse alone at 2:47 in the afternoon. He came through the brass-handled doors and into the November light, and the light was sharp and clear in the way of southern November afternoons when the humidity has finally relented and the sky is the particular dense blue that only appears after a long season of weather. He stood at the top of the courthouse steps for a moment and let the light fall on his face. He was carrying the attaché case in his right hand. He looked at his phone. There was a text from Imani sent at 2:32, 12 minutes before the verdict had been read aloud, which meant she had been watching the news coverage and had known what was coming before he did, or at least had known when to expect it. The text was a photograph. It was a photograph taken sometime in the night in November on the front porch of their house in Meadowbrook Estates. The porch light was on the small, warm-toned bulb above the front door that Imani had turned on the night of the traffic stop, and that Marcus had come home to at 10 minutes past midnight, the Cadillac pulling into the driveway, with the reins still on the hood, the case in the back seat, the red lines on his wrists. The light in the photograph was warm and solitary against the dark background of the neighborhood night, burning with the particular quality of something left on by someone who intends to wait. Below the photograph, 3 words: "Come home, Dad." Marcus looked at the photograph for a long moment. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, standing slightly apart from the small crowd of journalists and observers who had come out through the doors behind him, was Loretta Bryce. She was wearing the dark green dress. She had come down the steps ahead of him, apparently, and had positioned herself off to the side. Not to intercept him, not to make a statement for the cameras that were still operating at the courthouse perimeter, but simply to be there because being there was the thing she could do. Marcus came down the steps and crossed to where she was standing. They looked at each other for a moment without speaking. Loretta Bryce nodded once, the slow, complete nod of a person communicating something that language would diminish. The kind of nod that takes 3 years to fully earn and 2 seconds to give, and that means more than most people say in a lifetime. Marcus nodded back. Exactly the same nod. He could have said something. He had the professional vocabulary for most human moments. But this was not a moment that required his vocabulary, and he understood that, and he was quiet. After a moment, Loretta looked at the attaché case in his hand. "Is that the same one?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She looked at the scratch on the lock plate, faint a silver line against the brushed titanium, and she looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone looking at the precise object around which the thing they have been waiting for turned. Then she nodded again, looked up, and walked toward the street to find her son. Marcus stood there until she had gone. Then he hailed a cab. 3 weeks after sentencing, on a Tuesday morning that was cold and clear and carried the first real suggestion of winter, Darnell Bryce stood on the sidewalk in front of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta with a sheet of paper in his hand. The paper was a court order. It was signed by a federal judge. It was stamped with the seal of the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. It stated in the formal language of judicial decree that the conviction of Darnell Marcus Bryce, case number 2021-CR-0847-HAL, entered on May 14, 2021, in the Harlow County Superior Court, was hereby vacated in its entirety on the grounds that the evidence underlying the conviction was obtained through an unlawful seizure and was subsequently demonstrated to have been fabricated by law enforcement personnel currently under federal conviction. It stated that the arrest record pertaining to the above case was hereby expunged. It stated that Darnell Marcus Bryce was entitled to full restoration of all rights affected by the vacated conviction, including voting rights, housing rights, and employment rights. Darnell had read it 4 times already. He was reading it again. He was 22 years old, which was the same age he had always been going to be 3 years after the arrest, except that the 3 years had not passed in the way they were supposed to have passed. They had passed in a county correctional facility, and then in a state correctional facility, and then in a period of monitored release, and then in the slow, difficult process of trying to return to a life that had been interrupted at 19 in ways that did not straighten themselves out simply because the interruption was over. He was enrolled as of September in the automotive technology program at Harlow County Community College. He had a job offer formalized in writing the previous Friday from a garage on Calder Park Road, which was 2 blocks from his mother's house and which was owned by a man named Gerald, who had known his mother for 20 years and who had told Darnell at the end of the interview that he didn't care what was on someone's record if the person in front of him had the right quality of attention and the right quality of hands. Darnell had both. Marcus came down the courthouse steps at 9:30 and crossed to where Darnell was standing. He extended his hand and Darnell took it, a firm, direct handshake, the handshake of 2 people meeting on level ground. "How does it feel?" Marcus asked. Darnell considered the question with the same careful attention he had been applying to questions since his release. The quality of attention of a person who has learned that most things merit more consideration than they are given, and who has had the experience of understanding in detail what insufficient consideration costs. "It feels like it should have happened a long time ago," he said, "but I'm glad it happened." Marcus nodded. He looked at the court order in Darnell's hand. "Gerald's garage still offering start." "Monday," Darnell said. "Good," Marcus said, and he meant it in the specific, uncomplicated, entirely real way that one person means something when they have been working toward it for 11 months and it has arrived. Not good as in the satisfaction of a professional outcome. Good as in the basic, fundamental recognition that a 22-year-old man with capable hands and the quality of attention that Gerald had identified was going to start work on Monday, and that the road between here and there was open. They stood on the sidewalk in the November morning for another minute, not talking particularly the way two people stand when the most important things have already been said, and the remaining time is simply the time required to acknowledge that they have been in the same place together for something that mattered. Then they went in separate directions. Darnell toward the parking structure where his mother was waiting to drive him home. Marcus toward the lot where the Cadillac was parked. Marcus put the attaché case in the back seat. He locked it, and the lock clicked, and the sound was the same sound it had always made, clean, precise, entirely secure. And he got in the car and started the engine. He drove out of the parking lot and turned west on Peachtree, and then south on the connector, and then onto the county road that ran through the outer edges of Harlow County toward Meadowbrook Estates. He drove past the old Harlow Grain Co-op building, the one with the painted white letters fading on the corrugated metal siding. He drove past the long straightaway where the cruiser had first appeared in his rearview mirror on a Tuesday night in November. He drove past the particular amber street lamp beneath which the Cadillac had been parked, and the shoulder where Voss had gone to his knees, and the stretch of wet asphalt where a folding knife had fallen and stayed. He did not slow down. He drove through it at 33 miles per hour, the same speed he had been driving at on the night of the stop, and the road was empty in the afternoon light, and the sky above it was the particular dense blue of a southern November that has finished with its weather. He drove the last 3 miles to the house. He pulled into the driveway. He cut the engine. He sat there for a moment, then he reached into the back seat and picked up the attaché case and got out of the car and walked to the front door. The porch light was off. It was 2:30 in the afternoon, but the door opened before he reached it because Imani had heard the engine and she was standing in the doorway with the expression of a 17-year-old who has been doing her best for 11 months and is very glad the 11 months are over. Marcus walked through the door. There is a version of this story that wants to present what happened on County Road 9 as a coincidence, as the universe arranging its elements into a poetically satisfying shape, the corrupt officer stumbling upon the very prosecutor who held his fate in a locked case. That version is comfortable. It implies that justice is cosmically organized, that things ultimately balance themselves, that the scales correct without intervention. That version is wrong. What happened on that road was not a coincidence. It was the logical outcome of a pattern that had been operating unchecked for 22 years, executed by men who had been so thoroughly insulated from consequence that their arrogance had long since passed the point of self-examination. Arrogance of that depth does not distinguish between its targets. It cannot. The moment arrogance becomes categorical, the moment it applies not to individuals based on evidence, but to categories of people based on assumptions, it loses the capacity to perceive its own exposure. It cannot recognize the one person it should not stop because it has stopped seeing people. It has been stopping categories. Craig Pruitt did not stop a random citizen. He stopped the man who had spent 11 months documenting exactly what Pruitt had been doing to everyone else, And he stopped him because the car was expensive and the hour was late, and the man behind the wheel fit a profile that Pruitt had spent 18 years treating as a hunting license rather than a prejudice to be examined. The power that a badge represents is not personal property. It is borrowed from the people it is meant to protect, held in trust for a specific and limited purpose, and accountable always without exception to the people who granted it. The moment it is used to terrorize rather than protect the debt begins accumulating, and the debt always comes due. It came due on County Road 9 at 11:37 at night. It came due in Courtroom 6B 9 months later, and it will come due in whatever form is required wherever this pattern is allowed to operate. Darnell Bryce started at Gerald's garage the following Monday. By February, he was leading the morning diagnostic checks. By June, he had been offered a full-time position with benefits which he accepted. Loretta Bryce still works one job. She has been working one job since October, and she is learning slowly and with effort how to exhale. If this story matters to you, if Marcus's composure on that road, Loretta's 3 years, Darnell's Monday morning at the garage, and the sound of steel handcuffs clicking at sentencing around the wrists of the men who put them on an innocent person 9 months before, if any of that stays with you, subscribe to our channel. There are more stories here. Stories about people who were told they had no power and turned out to have more than anyone expected. Stories about what happens when arrogance meets the exact person it should not have. We read every comment. Tell us what you thought. Tell us whether 24 years was enough or whether no number is large enough for what was taken. Tell us whether you would have waited the way Marcus waited in the dark, in the rain, in handcuffs, certain that the record was being made. We'll see you in the next story.